Welcome to Classics You Slept Through's presentation of Wieland by Charles Brockden Brown, chapters 15 through 20. Chapter 15. Before I reached the city, it was dusk. It was my purpose to spend the night at Mettingen. I was not solicitous, as long as I was attended by a faithful servant, to be there at an early hour. My exhausted strength required me to take some refreshment. With this view, and in order to pay respect to one whose affection for me was truly maternal, I stopped at Mrs. Baton's. She was absent from home, but I had scarcely entered the house when one of her domestics presented me a letter. I opened it, and read as follows. To Clara Wieland. What shall I say to extenuate the misconduct of last night? It is my duty to repair it to the utmost of my power, but the only way in which it can be repaired, you will not, I fear, be prevailed on to adopt. It is by granting me an interview at your own house at 11 o'clock this night. I have no means of removing any fears that you may entertain of my designs, but my simple and solemn declarations. These, after what has passed between us, you may deem unworthy of confidence. I cannot help it. My folly and rashness has left me no other resource. I will be at your door by that hour. If you choose to admit me to a conference, provided that conference has no witnesses, I will disclose to you particulars, the knowledge of which is of the utmost importance to your happiness. Farewell. Carwin. What a letter was this! A man known to be an assassin and robber, one capable of plotting against my life and my fame, detected lurking in my chamber, and avowing designs the most litigious and dreadful, now solicits me to grant him a midnight interview. To admit him alone into my presence. Could he make this request with the expectation of my compliance? What had he seen in me that could justify him in admitting so wild a belief? Yet this request is preferred with the utmost gravity. It is not accompanied by an appearance of uncommon earnestness. Had the misconduct to which he alludes been a slight incivility, and the interview requested to take place in the midst of my friends, there would have been no extravagance in the tenor of this letter. But as it was, the writer had surely been bereft of his reason. I perused this epistle frequently. The request it contained might be called audacious or stupid, if it had been made by a different person. But from Carwin, who could not be unaware of the effect which it must naturally produce, and of the manner in which it would unavoidably be treated, it was perfectly inexplicable. He must have counted on the success of some plot in order to extort my assent. None of these motives by which I am usually governed would have ever persuaded me to meet any one of his sex at the time and place which he had prescribed. Much less would I consent to meeting with a man tainted with the most detestable crimes, and whose by arts my own safety had been so eminently endangered, and my happiness irretrievably destroyed. I shuddered at the idea that such a meeting was possible. I felt some reluctance to approach the spot which he still visited and haunted. Such were the ideas which first suggested themselves on the perusal of the letter. Meanwhile, I resumed my journey. My thoughts still dwelt upon the same topic. Gradually, from ruminating on this epistle, I reverted to my interview with Pleyel. I recalled the particulars of the dialogue to which he had been an auditor. My heart sunk anew on viewing the inextricable complexity of this deception, and the inauspicious concurrence of events which tended to confirm him in his error. When he approached my chamber door, my terror kept me mute. He put his ear, perhaps to the crevice, but it caught the sound of nothing human. Had I called, or made any token that denoted someone to be within, words would have ensued, and as omnipresence was impossible, this discovery, and the artless narrative of what had just passed, would have saved me from his murderous invectives. He went into his chamber, and after some interval, I stole across the entry and down the stairs with inaudible steps. Having secured the outer doors, I returned with less circumspection. He heard me not when I descended, but my returning steps were easily distinguished. Now, he thought, was the guilty interview at an end. In what other way was it possible for him to construe these signals? How fallacious and precipitous was my decision! Carwin's plot owed its success to a coincidence of events scarcely credible. The balance was swayed from its equipoise by a hair. Had I even begun the conversation with an account of what befell me in my chamber, my previous interview with Wieland would have taught him to suspect me of imposture. Yet, if I were discoursing with this ruffian, when Pleyel touched the lock of my chamber door, and when he shut his own door with so much violence, how, might he ask, should I be able to relate these incidents? Perhaps he had withheld the knowledge of these circumstances from my brother, for whom, therefore, I could not obtain it, so that my innocence would have thus been irresistibly demonstrated. The first impulse which flowed from these ideas was to return upon my steps, and demand once more an interview. But he was gone. His parting declarations were remembered. "Pleyel," I exclaimed, "thou art gone forever! Are thy mistakes beyond the reach of detection? Am I helpless in the midst of this snare? The plotter is at hand. He even speaks in the style of penitence. He solicits an interview, which he promises shall end in the disclosure of something momentous to my happiness. What can he say which will avail to turn aside this evil? But why should his remorse be feigned? I have done him no injury. His wickedness is fertile only of despair, and the billows of remorse will some time overbear him. Why may not this event have already taken place? Why should I refuse to see him?" This idea was present, as it were, for a moment. I suddenly recoiled from it, confounded at that frenzy which could give even momentary harbor to such a scheme. Yet presently it returned. At length I even conceived it to deserve deliberation. I questioned whether it was not proper to admit, at a lonely spot, in a sacred hour, this man of tremendous and inscrutable attributes, this performer of horrid deeds, and whose presence was predicted to call down unheard of and unutterable horrors. What was it that swayed me? I felt myself divested of the power to will contrary to the motives that determined me to seek his presence. My mind seemed to be split into separate parts, and these parts to have entered into furious and implacable contention. These tumults gradually subsided. The reasons why I should confide in that interposition which had hitherto defended me, in those tokens of compunction which this letter contained, in the efficacy of this interview to restore its spotlessness to my character and banish all illusions from the mind of my friend, continually acquired new evidence and new strength. What should I fear in his presence? This was unlike an artifice intended to betray me into his hands. If it were an artifice, what purpose would it serve? The freedom of my mind was untouched, and that freedom would defy the assaults of blandishments or magic. Force was I not able to repel. On the former occasion my courage, it is true, had failed at the imminent approach of danger. But then I had not enjoyed opportunities of deliberation. I had foreseen nothing. I was sunk into imbecility by my previous thoughts. I had been the victim of recent disappointments and anticipated ills. Witness my infatuation in opening the closet in opposition to divine injunctions. Now, perhaps, my courage was the offspring of no less erring principle. Pleyel was forever lost to me. I strove in vain to assume his person and suppress my resentment. I strove in vain to believe in the assuaging influence of time, to look forward to the birthday of new hopes and the re-exaltation of that luminary, of whose effulgencies I had so long and so liberally partaken. What had I to suffer worse than was already inflicted? Was not Carwin my foe? I owed my untimely fate to his treason. Instead of flying from his presence, ought I not to devote all my faculties to the gaining of an interview, and compel him to repair the ills to which he had been the author? Why should I suppose him impregnable to argument? Have I not reason on my side, and the power of imparting conviction? Cannot he be made to see the justice of unraveling the maze in which Pleyel is bewildered? He may at least be accessible to fear. Has he nothing to fear from the rage of an injured woman? But suppose him inaccessible to such inducements. Suppose him to persist in all his flagitious purposes. Are not the means of defense and resistance in my power? In the progress of such thoughts was the resolution at last formed. I hoped that the interview was sought by him for a laudable end, but, be that as it would, I trusted that by the energy of reasoning or action, I should render it auspicious, or at least harmless. Such a determination must unavoidably fluctuate. The poet's chaos was no unapt emblem of the state of my mind. A torment was awakened in my bosom, which I foresaw would end only when this interview was past, and its consequences fully experienced. Hence my impatience for the arrival of the hour which had been prescribed by Carwin. Meanwhile, my meditations were tumultuously active. New impediments to the execution of the scheme were speedily suggested. I had apprised Catherine of my intention to spend this and many future nights with her. Her husband was informed of this arrangement, and had zealously approved it. 11 o'clock exceeded the hour of retiring. What excuse should I form for changing my plan? Should I show this letter to Wieland, and submit myself to his direction? But I knew in what way he would decide. He would fervently dissuade me from going. Nay, would he not do more? He was apprised of the offences of Carwin, and of the reward offered for his apprehension. Would he not seize this opportunity of executing justice on a criminal? This idea was new. I was plunged once more into doubt. Did not equity enjoin me thus to facilitate his arrest? No. I disdained the office of betrayer. Carwin was unapprised of his danger, and his attentions were possibly beneficent. Should I station guards about the house and make an act, intended perhaps for my benefit, instrumental to his own destruction? Wieland might be justified in thus employing the knowledge which I should impart, but I, by imparting it, should pollute myself with more hateful crimes than those undeservedly imputed to me. This scheme, therefore, I unhesitatingly rejected. The views with which I should return to my own house it would therefore be necessary to conceal. Yet some pretext must be invented. I had never been initiated into the trade of lying. Yet what but falsehood was a deliberate suppression of the truth? To deceive by silence or by words is the same. And yet, what would a lie avail me? What pretext would justify this change in my plan? Would it not tend to confirm the imputations of Pleyel? That I should voluntarily return to a house in which honor and life had so lately been endangered could be explained in no way favorable to my integrity. These reflections, if they did not change, at least suspended my decision. In this state of uncertainty, I alighted at the hut. We gave this name to the house tenanted by the farmer and his servants, and which was situated on the verge of my brother's ground, and at a considerable distance from the mansion. The path to the mansion was planted by a double row of walnuts. Along this path I proceeded alone. I entered the parlor, in which a light was just expiring in the socket. There was no one in the room. I perceived by the clock that stood against the wall that it was near 11. The lateness of the hour startled me. What had become of the family? They were usually retired an hour before this, but the unextinguished taper and the unbarred door were indications that they had not retired. I again returned to the hall and passed from one room to another, but still encountered not a human being. I imagined that perhaps the lapse of a few minutes would explain these appearances. Meanwhile, I reflected that the preconcerted hour had arrived. Carwin was perhaps waiting my approach. Should I immediately retire to my own house, no one would be apprised of my proceeding. Nay, the interview may pass, and I be enabled to return in half an hour. Hence, no necessity would arise for dissimulation. I was so far influenced by these views that I rose to execute this design. But again, the unusual condition of the house occurred to me, and some vague solicitude as to the condition of the family. I was nearly certain that my brother had not retired, but by what motives he could be induced to desert his house thus unseasonably, I could by no means divine. Louisa Conway, at least, was at home and had probably retired to her chamber. Perhaps she was able to impart the information I wanted. I went to her chamber and found her asleep. She was delighted and surprised at my arrival and told me with how much impatience and anxiety my brother and his wife had waited my coming. They were fearful that some mishap had befallen me and had remained up longer than the usual period. Notwithstanding the lateness of the hour, Catherine would not resign the hopes of seeing me. Louisa said she had left them both in the parlor, and she knew of no cause for their absence. And yet, I was not without solicitude on account of their personal safety. I was far from being perfectly at ease on that head, but entertained no distinct conception of the danger that impended over them. Perhaps to beguile the moments of my long protracted stay, they had gone to walk upon the bank. The atmosphere, though illuminated only by starlight, was remarkably serene. Meanwhile, the desirableness of an interview with Carwin again returned, and I finally resolved to seek it. I passed with doubting and hasty steps along the path. My dwelling, seen at a distance, was gloomy and desolate. It had no inhabitant, for my servant, in the consequence of my new arrangement, had gone to Mettingen. The temerity of this attempt began to show itself in more vivid colors to my understanding. Whoever had pointed steel is not without arms, yet what must have been the state of my mind when I could meditate, without shuddering, on the use of a murderous weapon, and believe myself secure merely because I was capable of being made so by the death of another. Yet this was not my state. I felt as if I was rushing into deadly toils, without the power of pausing or receding. Chapter 16. As soon as I arrived in the sight of the front of my house, my attention was excited by a light from the window of my own chamber. No appearance could be less explicable. A meeting was expected with Carwin, but that he preoccupied my chamber and had supplied himself with light was not to be believed. What motive could influence him to adopt this conduct? Could I proceed until this was explained? Perhaps if I should proceed to a distance in front, someone would be visible. A sidelong but feeble beam from the window fell upon the piney copse which skirted the bank. As I eyed it, it suddenly became mutable, and after flitting to and fro for a short time, it vanished. I turned my eye again toward the window, and perceived that the light was still there, but the change which I had noticed was occasioned by a change in the position of the lamp or candle within. Hence, that some person was there was an unavoidable inference. I paused to deliberate on the propriety of advancing. Might I not advance cautiously, and therefore without danger? Might I not knock at the door, or call, and be apprised of the nature of my visitant before I entered? I approached and listened at the door, but could hear nothing. I knocked at first timidly, but afterwards with loudness. My signals were unnoticed. I stepped back and looked, but the light was no longer discernible. Was it suddenly extinguished by a human agent? What purpose but concealment was intended? Why was the illumination produced, to be thus suddenly brought to an end? And why, since someone was there, had silence been observed? These were questions, the solution of which may be readily supposed to be entangled with danger. Would not this danger, when measured by a woman's fears, expand into gigantic dimensions? Menaces of death, the stunning exertions of a warning voice, the known and unknown attributes of Carwin, our recent interview in this chamber, the pre-appointment of a meeting at this place and hour, all thronged into my memory. What was to be done? Courage is no definite or steadfast principle. Let that man who shall purpose to assign motives to the action of another blush at his folly and forbear. Not more presumptuous would it be to attempt the classification of all nature and the scanning of supreme intelligence. I gazed for a moment at the window and fixed my eyes for a second minute on the ground. I drew forth from my pocket and opened a penknife. This, said I, be my safeguard and avenger. The assailant shall perish, or myself shall fall. I had locked up the house in the morning, but had the key of the kitchen door in my pocket. I therefore determined to gain access behind. Thither I hastened, unlocked, and entered. All was lonely, darksome, and waste. Familiar as I was with every part of my dwelling, I easily found my way to the closet, drew forth a taper, a flint, tinder, and steel, and in a moment, as it were, gave myself the guidance and protection of light. What purpose did I meditate? Should I explore my way to my chamber, and then confront the being who had dared to intrude into this recess, and had labored for concealment? By putting out the light, did he seek to hide himself, or mean only to circumvent my incautious steps? Yet was it not more probable that he desired my absence, by thus encouraging the supposition that the house was unoccupied? I would see this man in spite of all impediments. Ere I died, I would see his face and summon him to penitence and retribution, no matter at what cost an interview was purchased. Reputation and life might be wrested from me by another, but my rectitude and honor were mine own keeping, and were safe. I proceeded to the foot of the stairs. At such a crisis, my thoughts may be supposed at no liberty to range, yet vague images rushed into my mind of the mysterious interposition which had been experienced on the last night. My case, at present, was not dissimilar, and if my angel were not weary of fruitless exertions to save, might not a new warning be expected? Who could say whether his silence were ascribable to the absence of danger, or to his own absence? In this state of mind, no wonder that a shivering cold crept through my veins, that my pause was prolonged, and that a fearful glance was thrown backwards. Alas, my heart droops, and my fingers are enervated. My ideas are vivid, but my language is faint. Now know I what it is to entertain incommunicable sentiments. The chain of subsequent incidents is drawn through my mind, and being linked with those which forewent, by turns rouse up agonies, and sink me into hopelessness. Yet I will persist to the end. My narrative may be invaded by inaccuracy and confusion, but if I live no longer, I will at least live to complete it. But what ambiguities, abruptnesses, and dark transitions can be expected from the historian who is, at the same time, the sufferer of these disasters? I have said that I cast a look behind. Some object was expected to be seen, or why should I have gazed in that direction? Two senses were at once assailed. The same piercing exclamation of "Hold! Hold!" was uttered within the same distance of my ear. This it was that I heard. The airy undulation and the shock given to my nerves were real. Whether the spectacle which I beheld existed in my fancy or without might be doubted. I had not closed the door of the apartment I had just left. The staircase, at the foot of which I stood, was 8 or 10 feet from the door, and attached to the wall through which the door led. My view, therefore, was sidelong, and took in no part of the room. Through this aperture was a head thrust, and drawn back with so much swiftness, the immediate conviction was that thus much of a form, ordinarily invisible, had been enshrouded. The face was turned towards me. Every muscle was tense. The forehead and brows were drawn into vehement expression. The lips were stretched as in the act of shrieking, and the eyes emitted sparks which, no doubt, if I had been unattended by a light, would have illuminated like the coruscations of a meteor. The sound and the vision were present, and they departed together at the same instant, but the cry was blown into my ear, while the face was many paces distant. This face was well suited to a being whose performances exceeded the standard of humanity, and yet its features were akin to those I had before seen. The image of Carwin was blended in 1,000 ways with the stream of my thoughts. This visage was perhaps portrayed by my fancy. If so, it will excite no surprise that some of his lineaments were now discovered. Yet affinities were few and inconspicuous, and were lost amidst the blaze of opposite qualities. What conclusion could I form? Be the face human or not, the intimation was imparted from above. Experience had evinced the benignity of the being who gave it. Once he had interposed to shield me from harm, and subsequent events demonstrated the usefulness of that interposition. Now was I again warned to forbear. I was hurrying to the verge of the same gulf, and the same power was exerted to recall my steps. Was it possible for me not to obey? Was I capable of holding on in the same perilous career? Yes, even of this I was capable. The intimation was imperfect. It gave no form to my danger, and prescribed no limits to my caution. I had formerly neglected it, and yet escaped. Might I not trust to the same issue? This idea might possess, though imperceptibly, some influence. I persisted, but it was not merely on this account. I cannot delineate the motives that led me on. I now speak as if no remnant of doubt existed in my mind as to the supernatural origin of these sounds, but this is owing to the imperfection of my language, for I only mean that the belief was more permanent and visited more frequently by my sober meditations than its opposite. The immediate effects served only to undermine the foundations of my judgment and precipitate my resolutions. I must either advance or return. I chose the former, and began to ascend the stairs. The silence underwent no second interruption. My chamber door was closed but unlocked, and, aided by vehement efforts of my courage, I opened and looked in. No hideous or uncommon object was discernible. The danger, indeed, might easily have lurked out of sight, have sprung upon me as I entered, and have rent me with his iron talons, but I was blind to this fate, and advanced, though cautiously, into the room. Still, everything wore its accustomed aspect. Neither lamp nor candle was to be found. Now, for the first time, suspicions were suggested as to the nature of the light which had been seen. Was it possible to have been the companion of that supernatural visage? A meteorous refulgence, producible at the will of him to whom that visage belonged, and partaking of the nature of that which accompanied my father's death. The closet was near, and I remembered the complicated horrors of which it had been productive. Here, perhaps, was enclosed the source of my peril, and the gratification of my curiosity. Should I adventure once more to explore its recesses? This was a resolution not easily formed. I was suspended in thought, when glancing my eye on a table, I perceived a written paper. Carwin's hand was instantly recognized, and, snatching up the paper, I read as follows. There was folly in expecting your compliance with my invitation. Judge how I was disappointed in finding another in your place. I have waited, but to wait any longer would be perilous. I shall still seek an interview, but it must be at a different time and place. Meanwhile, I will write this. How will you bear? How inexplicable will be this transaction? An event so unexpected, a sight so horrible. Such was this abrupt and unsatisfactory script. The ink was yet moist, the hand was that of Carwin. Hence it was to be inferred that he had this moment left the apartment, or was still in it. I looked back on the sudden expectation of seeing him behind me. What other did he mean? What transaction had taken place adverse to my expectations? What sight was about to be exhibited? I looked around me once more, but saw nothing which indicated strangeness. Again I remembered the closet, and was resolved to seek in that the solution of these mysteries. Here, perhaps, was enclosed the scene destined to awaken my horrors and baffle my foresight. I have already said that the entrance to this closet was beside my bed, which, on two sides, was closely shrouded by curtains. On that side nearest the closet, the curtain was raised. As I passed along, I cast my eye thither. I started, and looked again. I bore a light in my hand and brought it near my eyes, in order to dispel any elusive mists that might have hovered before them. Once more I fixed my eyes upon the bed, and hoped that this more steadfast scrutiny would annihilate the object which before seemed to be there. This, then, was the sight which Carwin had predicted. This was the event which my understanding was to find inexplicable. This was the fate which had been reserved for me, but which by some untoward chance had befallen on another. I had not been terrified by empty menaces. Violation and death awaited my entrance into this chamber. Some inscrutable chance had led her hither before me, and the merciless fangs which I was designed to be prey had mistaken their victim and fixed themselves in her heart. But where was my safety? Was the mischief exhausted or flown? The steps of the assassin had just been here. They could not be far off. In a moment he would rush into my presence, and I should perish under the same polluting and suffocating grasp. My frame shook, and my knees were unable to support me. I gazed alternately at the closet door and at the door of my room. At one of these avenues would enter the exterminator of my honor and my life. I was prepared for defense, but now that danger was imminent, my means of defense and my power to use them were gone. I was not qualified by education and experience to encounter perils like these, or perhaps I was powerless because I was again assaulted by surprise and had not fortified my mind by foresight and previous reflection against a scene like this. Fears of my own safety again yielded place to reflections on the scene before me. I fixed my eyes upon her countenance. My sister's well-known and beloved features could not be concealed by convulsion or lividness. What direful illusion led thee hither? Bereft of thee, what hold on happiness remains to thy offspring and thy spouse? To lose thee by a common fate would have been sufficiently hard, but thus to suddenly perish, to become the prey of this ghastly death, how will a spectacle like this be endured by Wieland? To die beneath his grasp would not satisfy thy enemy. This was mercy to the evils which he previously made thee suffer. After these evils, death was a boon which thou besoughtest him to grant. He entertained no enmity against thee. I was the object of his treason, but by some tremendous mistake his fury was misplaced. But how comest thou hither? And where was Wieland in thy hour of distress? I approached the corpse. I lifted the still flexible hand and kissed the lips which were breathless. Her flowing drapery was discomposed. I restored it to order, and, seating myself upon the bed, again fixed steadfast eyes upon her countenance. I cannot distinctly recollect the ruminations of that moment. I saw confusedly, but forcibly, that every hope was extinguished with the life of Catherine. All happiness and dignity must henceforth be banished from the house and name of Wieland. All that remained was to linger out in agonies a short existence, and to leave to the world a monument of blasted hopes and changeable fortune. Pleyel was already lost to me. Yet, while Catherine lived, life was not a detestable possession. But now, severed from the companion of my infancy, the partaker of all my thoughts, my cares, and my wishes, I was like one set afloat upon a stormy sea, and hanging his safety upon a plank. Night was closing upon him, and an unexpected surge had torn from him his hold, and overwhelmed him forever. Chapter 17. I had no inclination, nor power, to move from this spot. For more than an hour, my faculties and limbs seemed to be deprived of all activity. The door below creaked on its hinges, and steps ascended the stairs. My wandering and confused thoughts were instantly recalled by these sounds, and dropping the curtain of the bed, I moved to a part of the room where anyone who entered should be visible. Such are the vibrations of sentiment, that notwithstanding the seeming fulfillment of my fears and increase of my danger, I was conscious on this occasion to no turbulence, but that of curiosity. At length he entered the apartment, and I recognized my brother. It was the same Wieland whom I have ever seen, yet his features were pervaded by a new expression. I supposed him unacquainted with the fate of his wife, and his appearance confirmed this persuasion. A brow expanding into exultation I had hitherto never seen in him, yet such a brow did he now wear. Not only was he unapprised of the disaster that had happened, but some joyous occurrence had betided. What a reverse was preparing to annihilate his transitory bliss! No husband ever doted more fondly, for no wife ever claimed so boundless a devotion. I was not uncertain as to the effects to flow from the discovery of her fate. I confided not at all in the efforts of his reason or his piety. There were few evils which his modes of thinking would not disarm of their sting, but here all opiates to grief, and all compellers of patience were vain. This spectacle would be unavoidably followed by the outrages of desperation and a rushing to death. For the present, I neglected to ask myself what motive brought him hither. I was only fearful of the effects to flow from the sight of the dead. Yet, could it be long concealed from him? Some time, and speedily, he would obtain this knowledge. No stratagems could considerably or usefully prolong his ignorance. All that could be sought was to take away the abruptness of the change, and shut out the confusion of despair and the inroads of madness. But I knew my brother, and I knew that all exertions to console him would be fruitless. What could I say? I was mute, and poured forth those tears on his account, which my own unhappiness had been unable to extort. In the midst of my tears, I was not unobservant of his motions. These were of a nature to rouse some other sentiment than grief, or at least to mix with it a portion of astonishment. His countenance suddenly became troubled. His hands were clasped with a force that left the print of his nails in his flesh. His eyes were fixed on my feet. His brain seemed to swell beyond its continent. He did not cease to breathe, but his breath was stifled into groans. I had never witnessed the hurricane of human passions. My element had, till lately, been all sunshine and calm. I was unconversant with the altitudes and energies of sentiment, and was transfixed with an inexplicable horror by the symptoms which I now beheld. After a silence and a conflict which I could not interpret, he lifted his eyes to heaven, and in broken accents exclaimed, "This is too much! Any victim but this, and thy will be done! Have I not sufficiently attested my faith and my obedience? She that is gone, they that have perished, were linked with my soul by ties which only thy command would have broken. But here is sanctity and excellence surpassing human. This workmanship is thine, and it cannot be thy will to heap it into ruins." Here suddenly, unclasping his hands, he struck one of them against his forehead, and continued, "Wretch, who made thee quick-sighted in the counsels of thy Maker? Deliverance from moral fetters is awarded to this being, and thou art the minister of this decree." So saying, Wieland advanced towards me. His words and motions were without meaning, except on one supposition. The death of Catherine was already known to him, and that knowledge, as might have been suspected, had destroyed his reason. I feared nothing less, but now that I beheld the extinction of a mind the most luminous and penetrating that ever dignified the human form, my sensations were fraught with new and insupportable anguish. I had not time to reflect in what way my own safety would be affected by this revolution, or what I had to dread from the wild conceptions of a madman. He advanced towards me. Some hollow noises were wafted by the breeze. Confused clamors were succeeded by many feet traversing the grass, and then crowding into the piazza. These sounds suspended my brother's purpose, and he stood to listen. The signals multiplied and grew louder. Perceiving this, he turned from me and hurried out of my sight. All about me was pregnant with motives to astonishment. My sister's corpse, Wieland's frantic demeanor, and, at length, this crowd of visitants so little accorded with my foresight that my mental progress was stopped. The impulse had ceased, which was accustomed to give motion and order to my thoughts. Footsteps thronged upon the stairs, and presently many faces showed themselves within the door of my apartment. These looks were full of alarm and watchfulness. They pried into corners as if to search for some fugitive. Next their gaze was fixed upon me, and betokened all the vehemence of terror and pity. For a time I questioned whether these were not shapes and faces like that which I had seen at the bottom of the stairs, creatures of my fancy or airy existences. My eye wandered from one to another till at length it fell on a countenance which I well knew. It was that of Mr. Hallett. This man was a distant kinsman of my mother, venerable for his age and uprightness and sagacity. He had long discharged the functions of a magistrate and good citizen. If any terrors remained, his presence was sufficient to dispel them. He approached, took my hand, and with a compassionate air, said in a low voice, "Where, my dear Clara, are your brother and sister?" I made no answer, but pointed to the bed. His attendants drew aside the curtain, and while their eyes glared with horror at the spectacle which they beheld, those of Mr. Hallett overflowed with tears. After considerable pause, he once more turned to me. "My dear girl, this sight is not for you. Can you confide in my care and that of Mrs. Baynton's? We will see performed all that circumstances require." I made strenuous opposition to this request. I insisted on remaining near her till she were interred. His remonstrances, however, and my own feelings, showed me the propriety of a temporary dereliction. Louisa stood in need of a comforter, and my brother's children of a nurse. My unhappy brother was himself an object of solicitude and care. At length, I consented to relinquish the corpse and go to my brother's, whose house, I said, would need mistress, and his children a parent. During this discourse, my venerable friend struggled with his tears, but my last intimation called them forth with fresh violence. Meanwhile, his attendants stood round in mournful silence, gazing on me and at each other. I repeated my resolution, and rose to execute it. But he took my hand to detain me. His countenance betrayed irresolution and reluctance. I requested him to state the reason of his opposition to this measure. I entreated him to be explicit. I told him that my brother had just been there, and that I knew his condition. This misfortune had driven him to madness, and his offspring must not want a protector. If he chose, I would resign Wieland to his care, but his innocent and helpless babe stood in instant need of nurse and mother, and these offices I would by no means allow another to perform while I had life. Every word that I uttered seemed to augment his perplexity and distress. At last he said, "I think, Clara, I have entitled myself to some regard from you. You have professed your willingness to oblige me. Now I call upon you to confer upon me the highest obligation in your power. Permit Mrs. Baynton to have the management of your brother's house for 2 or 3 days, then it shall be yours, to act in it as you please. No matter what are my motives in making this request, perhaps I think of your age, your sex, or the distress which this disaster must occasion, incapacitates you for the office. Surely you have no doubt of Mrs. Baynton's tenderness or discretion." New ideas now rushed into my mind. I fixed my eyes steadfastly on Mr. Hallett. "Are they well?" I said. "Is Louisa well? Are Benjamin and William and Constantine and little Clara? Are they safe? Tell me truly, I beseech you." "They are well," he replied. "They are perfectly safe." "Fear no effeminate weakness in me. I can bear to hear the truth. Tell me truly, are they well?" He again assured me that they were well. "What then," resumed I, "do you fear? Is it possible for any calamity to disqualify me for performing my duties to these helpless innocents? I am willing to divide the care of them with Mrs. Baynton. I shall be grateful for her sympathy and aid, but what should I be to desert them at an hour like this?" I will cut short this distressful dialogue. I still persisted in my purpose, and he still persisted in his opposition. This excited my suspicions anew, but these were removed by solemn declarations of their safety. I could not explain this conduct in my friend, but at length consented to go to the city, provided I should see them for a few minutes at present, and then should return on the morrow. Even this arrangement was objected to. At length he told me they were removed to the city. Why were they removed, I asked, and whither? My importunities would now not be eluded. My suspicions were roused, and no evasion or artifice was sufficient to allay them. Many of the audience began to give vent to their emotions in tears. Mr. Hallett himself seemed as if the conflict were too hard to be longer sustained. Something whispered to my heart that havoc had been wider than I now witnessed. I suspected this concealment to arise from apprehensions to the effects which a knowledge of the truth would produce in me. I once more entreated him to inform me truly of their state. To enforce my entreaties, I put on an air of insensibility. "I can guess," I said, "what has happened. They are indeed beyond the reach of injury, for they are dead. Is it not so?" My voice faltered in spite of my courageous efforts. "Yes," he said, "they are dead. Dead by the same fate and by the same hand with their mother." "Dead," I replied. "What, all?" "All," he replied. "He spared not one." Allow me, my friends, to close my eyes upon the after scene. Why should I protract a tale which I already begin to feel is too long? Over this scene, at least, let me pass lightly. Here, indeed, my narrative would be imperfect. All was tempestuous commotion in my heart and in my brain. I have no memory for aught but unconscious transitions and rueful sights. I was ingenuous and indefatigable in the invention of torments. I would not dispense with any spectacle adapted to exasperate my grief. Each pale and mangled form I crushed to my bosom. Louisa, whom I loved with so ineffable a passion, was denied to me at first, but my obstinacy conquered their reluctance. They led the way into a darkened hall. A lamp pendant from the ceiling was uncovered, and they pointed to a table. The assassin had defrauded me of my last and miserable consolation. I sought not in her visage for the tinge of the morning, but the luster of heaven. These had vanished with life, but I hoped for liberty to print a last kiss upon her lips. This was denied me, for such had been the merciless blow that destroyed her, that not a lineament remained. I was carried hence to the city. Mrs. Hallett was my companion and my nurse. Why should I dwell upon the rage of fever and the effusions of delirium? Carwin was the phantom that pursued my dreams, the giant oppressor under whose arm I was forever on the point of being crushed. Strenuous muscles were required to hinder my flight, and hearts of steel to withstand the eloquence of my fears. In vain I called upon them to look upward, to mark his sparkling rage and scowling contempt. All I sought was to fly from the stroke that was lifted. Then I heaped upon my guards the most vehement reproaches, or betook myself to wailings on the haplessness of my condition. This malady at length declined, and my weeping friends began to look for my restoration. Slowly, and with intermittent beams, memory revisited me. The scenes that I had witnessed were revived, became the theme of deliberation and deduction, and called forth the effusions of more rational sorrow.
Chapter 18. I had imperfectly recovered my strength when I was informed of the arrival of my mother's brother, Thomas Cambridge. 10 years since, he went to Europe and was a surgeon in the British forces in Germany during the whole of the late war. After its conclusion, some connection that he had formed with an Irish officer made him retire into Ireland. Intercourse had been punctually maintained by letters with his sister's children, and hopes were given that he would shortly return to his native country and pass his old age in our society. He was now, in an evil hour, arrived. I desired an interview with him for numerous and urgent reasons. With the first returns of my understanding, I had anxiously sought information of the fate of my brother. During the course of my disease, I had never seen him, and vague and unsatisfactory answers were returned to all my inquiries. I had vehemently interrogated Mrs. Hallett and her husband, and solicited an interview with this unfortunate man. But they mysteriously insinuated that his reason was still unsettled, and that his circumstances rendered an interview impossible. Their reserve on the particulars of this destruction and the author of it was equally invincible. For some time, finding all my efforts fruitless, I had desisted from direct inquiries and solicitations, determined, as though my strength was sufficiently renewed, to pursue other means of dispelling my uncertainty. In this state of things, my uncle's arrival and intention to visit me were announced. I almost shuddered to behold the face of this man. When I reflected on the disasters that had befallen us, I was half unwilling to witness that dejection and grief which would be disclosed in his countenance. But I believed that all transactions had been thoroughly disclosed to him, and confided in my importunity to extort from him the knowledge that I sought. I had no doubt as to the person of our enemy, but the motives that urged him to perpetrate these horrors, the means that he used, and his present condition were totally unknown. It was reasonable to expect some information on this head from my uncle. I therefore waited his coming with impatience. At length, in the dusk of the evening, in my solitary chamber, this meeting took place. This man was our nearest relation, and had ever treated us with the affection of a parent. Our meeting, therefore, could not be without overflowing tenderness and gloomy joy. He rather encouraged than restrained the tears that I poured out on his arms, and took upon himself the task of comforter. Allusions to recent disasters could not be long omitted. One topic facilitated the omission of another. At length, I mentioned and deplored the ignorance in which I had been kept respecting my brother's destiny and the circumstances of our misfortunes. I entreated him to tell me what was Wieland's condition, and what progress had been made in detecting or punishing the author of this unheard-of devastation. "The author?" said he. "Do you know the author?" "Alas," I answered, "I am too well acquainted with him. The story of the grounds of my suspicion would be painful and too long. I am not apprised of the extent of your present knowledge. There are none but Wieland, Pleyel, and myself who are able to relate certain facts." "Spare yourself the pain," said he. "All that Wieland and Pleyel can communicate, I know already. If anything of moment has fallen within your own exclusive knowledge, and the relation be not too arduous for your present strength, I confess I am desirous of hearing it. Perhaps you allude to one by the name of Carwin? I will anticipate your curiosity by saying that since the disasters, no one has seen or heard from him. His agency is, therefore, a mystery still unsolved." I readily complied with his request and related as distinctly as I could, though in general terms, the events transacted in the summer house and my chamber. He listened without apparent surprise to the tale of Pleyel's errors and suspicions, and with augmented seriousness to my narrative of the warnings and inexplicable vision and the letter found upon the table. I waited for his comments. "You gather from this," said he, "that Carwin is the author of all this misery." "Is it not," answered I, "an unavoidable inference? But what know you respecting it? Was it possible to execute this mischief without witness or coadjutor? I beseech you to relate to me when and why Mr. Hallett was summoned to the scene, and by whom this disaster was first suspected or discovered. Surely suspicion must have fallen upon someone, and pursuit was made." My uncle rose from his seat and traversed the floor with hasty steps. His eyes were fixed upon the ground, and he seemed buried in perplexity. At length, he paused and said with an emphatic tone, "It is true. The instrument is known. Carwin may have plotted, but the execution was another's. That other is found, and his deed is ascertained." "Good heaven!" I exclaimed. "What say you? Was not Carwin the assassin? Could any hand but his have carried into act this dreadful purpose?" "Have I not said," returned he, "that the performance was another's? Carwin, perhaps, or heaven, or insanity, prompted the murderer. But Carwin is unknown. The actual performer has long since been called to judgment and convicted, and is at this moment at the bottom of a dungeon loaded with chains." I lifted my hands and eyes. Who, then, is this assassin? By what means and whither was he traced? What is the testimony of his guilt? "His own, corroborated with that of a servant maid who spied the murder of the children from a closet where she was concealed. The magistrate returned from your dwelling to your brother's. He was employed in hearing and recording the testimony of the only witness, when the criminal himself, unexpected, unsolicited, unsought, entered the hall, acknowledged his guilt, and rendered himself up to justice. He has since been summoned to the bar. The audience was composed of thousands whom rumors of this wonderful event had attracted from the greatest distance. A long and impartial examination was made, and the prisoner was called upon for his defense. In compliance with this call, he delivered an ample relation of his motives and actions. There he stopped. I besought him to say who this criminal was and what the instigations that compelled him. My uncle was silent. I urged this inquiry with new force. I reverted to my own knowledge and sought in his some basis to conjecture. I ran over the scanty catalogue of men whom I knew. I lighted on no one who was qualified for the ministering to malice like this. Again I resorted to importunity. Had I ever seen the criminal? Was it sheer cruelty or diabolical revenge that produced this overthrow? He surveyed me for a considerable time and listened to my interrogations in silence. At length he spoke. Clara, I have known thee by report, and in some degree by observation. Thou art a being of no vulgar sort. Thy friends have hitherto treated thee as a child. They meant well, but perhaps they were unacquainted with thy strength. I assure myself that nothing will surpass thy fortitude. Thou art anxious to know the destroyer of thy family, his actions, and his motives. Shall I call him to thy presence and permit him to confess before thee? Shall I make him the narrator of his own tale? I started on my feet and looked round me with fearful glances as if the murderer was close at hand. What do you mean? Said I. Put an end, I beseech you, to this suspense. Be not alarmed. You will never more behold the face of this criminal unless he be gifted with supernatural strength and sever like threads the constraint of links and bolts. I have said that the assassin was arraigned at the bar and that the trial ended with summons from the judge to confess or to vindicate his actions. A reply was immediately made with significance of gesture and a tranquil majesty which denoted less of humanity than godhead. Judges, advocates, and auditors were panic-struck and breathless with attention. One of the hearers faithfully recorded the speech. There it is, continued he, putting a roll of papers in my hand. You may read it at your leisure. With these words, my uncle left me alone. My curiosity refused me a moment's delay. I opened the papers and read as follows. Chapter 19. Theodore Wieland, the prisoner at the bar, was now called upon for his defense. He looked around him for some time in silence, and with mild countenance, at length, he spoke. It is strange. I am known to my judges and my auditors. Who is there present a stranger to the character of Wieland? Who knows him not as a husband, as a father, as a friend? Yet here I am arraigned as a criminal. I am charged with diabolical malice. I am accused of the murder of my wife and my children. It is true. They were slain by me. They all perished by my hand. The task of vindication is ignoble. What is it then that I am called to vindicate, and before whom? You know that they are dead, and that they were killed by me. What more would you have? Would you extort from me a statement of my motives? Have you failed to discover them already? You charge me with malice, but your eyes are not shut. Your reason is still vigorous. Your memory has not forsaken you. You know whom it is that you thus charge. The habits of his life are known to you. The treatment of his wife and his offspring is known to you. The soundness of his integrity and the unchangeableness of his principles are familiar to your apprehension. Yet you persist in this charge. You lead me hither, manacled as a felon. You deem me worthy of a vile and tormenting death. Who Who are they whom I have devoted to death? My wife, the little ones, that drew their being from me, that creature who, as she surpassed them in excellence, claimed a larger affection than those whom natural affinities bound to my heart. Think ye that malice could have urged me to do this deed? Hide your audacious fronts from the scrutiny of heaven. Take refuge in some cavern unvisited by human eyes. Ye may deplore your wickedness or folly, but ye cannot expiate it. Think not that I speak for your sakes. Hug to your hearts this detestable infatuation. Deem me still a murderer, and drag me untimely to death. I make not an effort to dispel your illusion. I utter not a word to cure you of your sanguinary folly. But there are probably some in this assembly who have come from afar, for their sakes, whose distance has disabled them from knowing me. I will tell you what I have done and why. It is needless to say that God is the object of my supreme passion. I have cherished in his presence a single and upright heart. I have thirsted for the knowledge of his will. I have burnt with ardor to approve my faith and my obedience. My days have been spent in searching for the revelation of that will, but my days have been mournful because my search failed. I solicited direction. I turned on every side where glimmerings of light could be discovered. I have not been wholly uninformed, but my knowledge has always stopped short of certainty. Dissatisfaction has insinuated itself into all my thoughts. My purposes have been pure, my wishes indefatigable. But not till lately were these purposes thoroughly accomplished, and these wishes fully gratified. I thank thee, my Father, for thy bounty, that thou didst not ask a less sacrifice than this, that thou placed me in a condition to testify my submission to thy will. What have I withheld, which it was thy pleasure to exact? Now may I, with dauntless and erect eye, claim my reward, since I have given thee the treasure of my soul. I was at my own house. It was late in the evening. My sister had gone to the city, but proposed to return. It was in expectation of her return that my wife and I delayed going to bed beyond the usual hour. The rest of the family, however, were retired. My mind was contemplative and calm, not wholly devoid of apprehension on account of my sister's safety. Recent events, not easily explained, had suggested the existence of some danger, but this danger was without a distinct form in our imagination and scarcely ruffled our tranquility. Time passed, and my sister did not arrive. Her house is at some distance from mine, and though her arrangements had been made with a view to residing with us, it was possible that, through forgetfulness or the occurrence of unforeseen emergencies, she had returned to her own dwelling. Hence it was conceived proper that I should ascertain the truth by going thither. I went. On my way, my mind was full of these ideas which related to my intellectual condition. In the torrent of fervid conceptions, I lost sight of my purpose. Sometimes I stood still. Sometimes I wandered from my path and experienced some difficulty on recovering from my fit of musings to regain it. The series of my thoughts is easily traced. At first, every vein beat with raptures known only to the man whose paternal and conjugal love is without limits, and the cup of whose desires, immense as it is, overflows with gratification. I know not why emotions that were perpetual visitants should now have recurred with unusual energy. The transition was not new from sensations of joy to a consciousness of gratitude. The author of my being was likewise the dispenser of every gift with which that being was embellished. The service to which a benefactor like this was entitled could not be circumscribed. My social sentiments were indebted to their alliance with devotion for all their value. My passions are base, all joys feeble, all energies malignant, which are not drawn from this source. For a time, my contemplation soared above the earth and its inhabitants. I stretched forth my hands, I lifted my eyes and exclaimed, "Oh, that I might be admitted to thy presence, that mine were the supreme delight of knowing thy will and of performing it." the blissful privilege of direct communication with thee and of listening to the audible enunciation of thy pleasure. What task would I not undertake? What privation would I not cheerfully endure to testify my love of thee? Alas, thou hiddest thyself from my view. Glimpses only of thy excellence and beauty are afforded me. Would that a momentary emanation from thy glory would visit me, that some unambiguous token of thy presence would salute my senses. In this mood, I entered the house of my sister. It was vacant. Scarcely had I regained recollection of the purpose that brought me hither. Thoughts of a different tendency had such absolute passion of my mind that the relations of time and space were almost obliterated from my understanding. These wanderings, however, were restrained, and I ascended to her chamber. I had no light, and might have known by external observation that the house was without any inhabitant. With this, however, I was not satisfied. I entered the room, and the object of my search not appearing, I prepared to return. The darkness required some caution in descending the stair. I stretched my hand to seize the balustrade, which I might regulate my steps. How shall I describe the luster which, at that moment, burst upon my vision? I was dazzled. My organs were bereaved of their activity. My eyelids were half closed, and my hands withdrawn from the balustrade. A nameless fear chilled my veins, and I stood motionless. This irritation did not retire or lessen. It seemed as if some powerful effulgence covered me like a mantle. I opened my eyes and found all about me luminous and glowing. It was the element of heaven that flowed around. Nothing but fiery stream was visible at first, but anon a shrill voice from behind called me to attend. I turned. It is forbidden to describe what I saw. Words indeed would be wanting to the task. The lineaments of that being whose veil was now lifted and whose visage beamed upon my sight, no hues of pencil or of language can portray. As it spoke, the accents thrilled to my heart. Thy prayers are heard. In proof of thy faith, render me thy wife. Call her hither, and here let her fall. The sound and visage and light vanished at once. What demand was this? The blood of Catherine was to be shed. My wife was to perish by my hand. I sought opportunity to attest my virtue. Little did I expect that a proof like this would have been demanded. My wife! I exclaimed. Oh God, substitute some other victim. Make me not the butcher of my wife. My own blood is cheap. This I will pour out before thee with a willing heart, but spare, I beseech thee, this precious life, or commission some other than her husband to perform the bloody deed. In vain. The conditions were prescribed, the decree had gone forth, and nothing remained but to execute it. I rushed out of the house and across the intermediate fields, and stopped, not till I entered my own parlor. My wife had remained here during my absence, and in anxious expectation of my return with some tidings of her sister. I had none to communicate. For a time I was breathless with my speed. This, and the tremors that shook my frame, and the wildness of my looks alarmed her. She immediately suspected some disaster to have happened to her friend, and her own speech was much overpowered by emotion as mine. She was silent, but her looks manifested her impatience to hear what I had to communicate. I spoke, but with so much precipitation is scarcely to be understood, catching her, at the same time, by the arm and forcibly pulling her from her seat. "Come along with me. Fly. Waste not a moment. Time will be lost, and the deed will be omitted. Tarry not, question not, but fly with me." This deportment added afresh to her alarms. Her eyes pursued mine, and she said, "What is the matter? For God's sake, what is the matter? Where would you have me go?" My eyes were fixed upon her countenance while she spoke. I thought upon her virtues. I viewed her as the mother of my babes, as my wife. I recalled the purpose for which I was thus urged her attendance. My heart faltered, and I saw that I must rouse to this work all my faculties. The danger of the latest delay was imminent. I looked away from her, and again, exerting my force, drew her towards the door. "You must go with me. Indeed you must." In her fright, she half resisted my efforts and again exclaimed, "Good heaven! What is it you mean? Where go? What has happened? Have you found Clara?" "Follow me and you will see," I answered, still urging her reluctant steps forward. "What frenzy has seized you? Something must needs have happened. Is she sick? Have you found her?" "Come and see. Follow me and know for yourself." Still she expostulated and besought me to explain this mysterious behavior. I could not trust myself to answer her, to look at her, but grasping her arm, I drew her after me. She hesitated, rather through confusion of mind than from unwillingness to accompany me. This confusion gradually abated, and she moved forward, but with irresolute steps and continual exclamations of wonder and terror. Her interrogations of what was the matter and whither was I going were ceaseless and vehement. It was the scope of my efforts not to think, to keep up a conflict and uproar in my mind in which all order and distinctness should be lost, to escape the sensations produced by her voice. I was therefore silent. I strove to abridge this interval by my haste and to waste all my attention in furious gesticulations. In this state of mind, we reached my sister's door. She looked at the windows and saw that all was desolate. "Why come here? There is nobody here." "I will not go in." Still, I was dumb. But opening the door, I drew her into the entry, and this was the allotted scene. Here she was to fall. I let her go, and pressing my palms against my forehead, made one mighty effort to work my soul to the deed. In vain. It would not be. My courage was appalled, my arms nerveless. I muttered prayers that my strength might be aided from above. They availed nothing. Horror diffused itself over me. This conviction of my cowardice, my rebellion fastened upon me, and I stood rigid, as cold as marble. From this state I was somewhat relieved by my wife's voice, who renewed her supplications to be told why we came hither, and what was the fate of my sister. What could I answer? My words were broken and inarticulate. Her fears naturally acquired force from the observation of these symptoms, but these fears were misplaced. The only inference she deduced from my conduct was that some terrible mishap had befallen Clara. She swung her hands and exclaimed in agony, "Oh, tell me, where is she? What has become of her? Is she sick? Dead? Is she in her chamber? Oh, let me go thither and know the worst." This proposal set my thoughts once more in motion. Perhaps what my rebellious heart refused to perform here, I might obtain strength enough to execute elsewhere. "Come then," said I. "Let us go." "I will, but not in the dark. We must first procure light." "Fly then and procure it, but I charge you linger not. I will await for your return." While she was gone, I strode along the entry. The fellness of a gloomy hurricane but faintly resembled the discord that reigned in my mind. To omit this sacrifice must not be, yet my sinews had refused to perform it. No alternative was offered. To rebel against the mandate was impossible, but obedience would render me the executioner of my wife. My will was strong, but my limbs refused their office. She returned with a light, and I led the way to the chamber. She looked round her. She lifted the curtain of the bed. She saw nothing. At length she fixed inquiring eyes upon me. The light now enabled her to discover in my visage what darkness had hitherto concealed. Her cares were now transferred from my sister to myself, and she said in a tremulous voice, "Wieland, you are not well. What ails you? What can I do nothing for you?" That accents and looks so winning should disarm me of my resolution was to be expected. My thoughts were thrown anew into anarchy. I spread my hand before my eyes that I might not see her, and answered only by groans. She took my other hand between hers, and pressing it to her heart, spoke with that voice which had ever swayed my will and wafted away my sorrow. "My friend, my soul's friend, tell me thy cause of grief. Do I not merit to partake with thee in thy cares? Am I not thy wife?" This was too much. I broke from her embrace and retired to a corner of the room. In this pause, courage was once more infused into me. I resolved to execute my duty. She followed me, and with renewed, passionate entreaties, to know the cause of my distress. I raised my head and regarded her with steadfast looks. I muttered something about death and the injunctions of my duty. At these words, she shrunk back and looked at me with a new expression of anguish. After a pause, she clasped her hands and exclaimed, "Oh, Wieland, Wieland, God grant that I am mistaken, but surely something is wrong. I see it is too plain. Thou art undone, and lost to me and to thyself." At the same time, she gazed on my features with intensest anxiety in hope that different symptoms would take place. I replied to her with vehemence, "Undone! No, my duty is known, and I thank my God that my cowardice is now vanquished, and I have power to fulfill it. Catherine, I pity the weakness of thy nature. I pity thee, but must not spare. Thy life is claimed from my hands. Thou must die." Fear was now added to her grief. "What mean you? Why talk you of death? Bethink yourself, Wieland, bethink yourself, and this fit will pass. Oh, why came I hither? Why did you drag me hither? I brought thee hither to fulfill a divine command. I am appointed by thy destroyer, and destroy thee I must." Saying this, I seized her wrists. She shrieked aloud and endeavored to free herself from my grasp, but her efforts were in vain. Surely, Wieland, thou dost not mean it. Am I not thy wife? And wouldst thou kill me? Thou wilt not, and yet I see. Thou art Wieland no longer. A fury resistless and horrible possesses thee. Spare me, spare! Help! Help! Till her breath was stopped, she shrieked for help, for mercy. When she could speak no longer, her gestures, her looks appealed to my compassion. My accursed hand was irresolute and tremulous. I meant thy death to be sudden, thy struggles to be brief. Alas, my heart was infirm, my resolves mutable. Thrice I slackened my grasp, and life kept its hold, though in the midst of pangs. Her eyeballs started from their sockets. Grimness and distortion took place of all that used to bewitch me and to transport and subdue me into reverence. I was commissioned to kill thee, but not to torment thee with the foresight of thy death, not to multiply thy fears and prolong thy agonies. Haggard and pale and lifeless, at length thou ceased to contend with thy destiny. This was a moment of triumph. Thus, I had successfully subdued the stubbornness of human passions. The victim which had been demanded was given. The deed was done past recall. I lifted the corpse in my arms and laid it on the bed. I gazed upon it with delight. Such was the elation of my thoughts that even I broke into laughter. I clapped my hands and exclaimed, "It is done! My sacred duty is fulfilled. To that I have sacrificed, oh my God, thy last and best gift, my wife." For a while I thus soared above frailty. I imagined I had set myself forever beyond the reach of selfishness, but my imaginations were false. This rapture quickly subsided. I looked again at my wife. My joyous ebullitions were vanished, and I asked myself who it was whom I saw. Methought it could not be Catherine. It could not be the woman who had lodged for years in my heart, who had slept nightly in my bosom, who had borne in her womb, who had fostered at her breast the beings who called me father, whom I had watched with delight and cherished with a fondness ever new and perpetually growing. It could not be the same. Where was her bloom? These deadly and blood-suffused orbs but ill resemble the azure and ecstatic tenderness of her eyes, the lucid stream that meandered over that bosom, the glow of love that was wont to sit upon that cheek, are much unlike these livid stains and this hideous deformity. Alas, these were the traces of agony. The grip of the assassin had been here. I will not dwell upon my lapse into desperate and outrageous sorrow. The breath of heaven that sustained me was withdrawn, and I sunk into mere man. I leaped from the floor. I dashed my head against the wall. I uttered screams of horror. I panted after torment and pain. Eternal fire and the bickerings of hell compared with what I felt were music and a bed of roses. I thank my God that this degeneracy was transient, that he designed once more to raise me aloft. I thought upon what I had done as a sacrifice to duty and was calm. My wife was dead, but I reflected that though this source of human consolation was closed, yet others were still open. If the transports of a husband were no more, the feelings of a father had still scope for exercise. When remembrance of their mother should excite too keen a pang, I would look upon them and be comforted. While I resolved these ideas, a new warmth flowed upon my heart. I was wrong. These feelings were the growth of selfishness. Of this I was not aware, and to dispel the mist that obscured my perceptions, a new effulgence and a new mandate were necessary. From these thoughts I was recalled by a ray that was shot into the room. A voice spake like that which I had before heard. "Thou hast done well, but all is not done. The sacrifice is incomplete. Thy children must be offered. They must perish with their mother." Chapter 20. Will you wonder that I read no farther? Will you not rather be astonished that I read thus far? What power supported me through such a task I know not. Perhaps the doubt from which I could not disengage my mind that the scene here depicted was a dream contributed to my perseverance. In vain the solemn introduction of my uncle, his appeals to my fortitude and allusions to something monstrous in the events he was about to disclose, in vain the distressful perplexity, the mysterious silence and ambiguous answers of my attendants, especially when the condition of my brother was the theme of my inquiries, were remembered. I recalled the interview with Wieland in my chamber. His preternatural tranquility succeeded by bursts of passion and menacing actions. All these coincided with the tenor of this paper. Catherine and her children and Louisa were dead. The act that destroyed them was, in the highest degree, inhuman. It was worthy of savages trained to murder and exulting in agonies. Who was the performer of the deed? Wieland? My brother. The husband and the father. That man of gentle virtues and invincible benignity, placable and mild, an idolater of peace. Surely, said I, it is a dream. For many days have I been vexed with frenzy. Its dominion is still felt, but new forms are called up to diversify and augment my torments. The paper dropped from my hand, and my eyes followed it. I shrunk back as if to avoid some petrifying influence that approached me. My tongue was mute. All the functions of nature were at a stand, and I sunk upon the floor, lifeless. The noise of my fall, as I afterwards heard, alarmed my uncle, who was in a lower apartment and whose apprehensions had detained him. He hastened to my chamber and administered the assistance which my condition required. When I opened my eyes, I beheld him before me. His skill as a reasoner, as well as a physician, was exerted to obviate the injurious effects upon the disclosure, but he had wrongly estimated the strength of my body or of my mind. This shock brought me once more to the brink of the grave, and my malady was much more difficult to subdue than at first. I will not dwell upon the long train of dreary sensations and the hideous confusion of my understanding. Time slowly resorted its customary firmness to my frame, and order to my thoughts. The images impressed upon my mind by this fatal paper were somewhat affected by my malady. They were obscure and disjointed like the parts of a dream. I was desirous of freeing my imagination from this chaos. For this end I questioned my uncle, who was my constant companion. He was intimidated by the issue of his first experiment and took pains to elude or discourage my inquiry. My impetuosity sometimes compelled him to have resort to misinterpretations and untruths. Time effected that end, perhaps, in a more beneficial manner. In the course of my meditations, the recollections of the past gradually became more distinct. I revolved them, however, in silence, and being no longer accompanied with surprise, they did not exercise a death-dealing blow. I had discontinued the perusal of the paper in the midst of the narrative, but what I read, combined with the information elsewhere obtained, threw perhaps sufficient light upon the detestable transactions. Yet my curiosity was not inactive. I desired to pursue the remainder. My eagerness to know the particulars of this tale was mingled and debated by my antipathy to the scene which would be disclosed. Hence I employed no means to effect my purpose. I desired knowledge, and at the same time shrunk back from receiving the boon. One morning, being left alone, I rose from my bed and went to a drawer where my finer clothing used to be kept. I opened it, and this fatal paper saluted my sight. I snatched it involuntarily and withdrew to a chair. I debated for a few minutes whether I should open and read. Now that my fortitude was put to trial, it failed. I felt myself incapable of deliberately surveying a scene of so much horror. I was prompted to return it to its place, but this resolution gave way, and I determined to peruse some part of it. I turned over the leaves till I came near the conclusion. The narrative of the criminal was finished, the verdict of guilty reluctantly pronounced by the jury, and the accused interrogated why sentence of death should not pass. The answer was brief, solemn, and emphatical. No, I have nothing to say. My tale has been told, my motives have been truly stated. If my judges are unable to discern the purity of my intentions, or to credit the statement of them which I have just made, if they see not that my deed was enjoined by heaven, that obedience was the test of perfect virtue, and the extinction of selfishness and error, they must pronounce me a murderer. They refuse to credit my tale. They impute my acts to the influence of demons. They account me as an example of the highest wickedness of which human nature is capable. They doom me to death and infamy. Have I power to escape this evil? If I have, be sure I will exert it. I will not accept evil at their hand, when I am entitled to good. I will suffer only when I cannot elude suffering. You say that I am guilty, impious and rash, thus to usurp the prerogatives of your Maker, to set up your bounded views and halted reason as the measure of truth. Thou, omnipotent and holy, thou knowest my actions were conformable to thy will. I know not what is crime, what actions are evil in their ultimate and comprehensive tendency, or what are good. Thy knowledge, as thy power, is unlimited. I have taken thee for my guide and cannot err. To the arms of thy protection I entrust my safety. In the awards of thy justice I confide for my recompense. Come death when it will, I am safe. Let calumny and abhorrence pursue me among men. I shall not be defrauded of my dues. The peace of virtue and the glory of obedience will be my portion hereafter. Here ended the speaker. I withdrew my eyes from the page, but before I had time to reflect on what I had read, Mr. Cambridge entered the room. He quickly perceived how I had been employed and betrayed some solicitude respecting the condition of my mind. His fears, however, were superfluous. What I had read threw me into a state not easily described. Anguish and fury, however, had no part in it. My faculties were chained up in wonder and awe. Just then I was unable to speak. I looked at my friend with an air of inquisitiveness and pointed at the roll. He comprehended my inquiry and answered me with looks of gloomy acquiescence. After some time my thoughts found their way to my lips. Such then were the acts of my brother. Such were his words. For this he was condemned to die upon the gallows. A fate cruel and unmerited. And is it not so? Continued I, struggling for utterance, which this new idea made difficult. Is he dead? No. He is alive. There could be no doubt as to the cause of these excesses. They originated in sudden madness, but that madness continues, and he is condemned to perpetual imprisonment. Madness, you say? Are you sure? Were not these sights and these sounds really seen and heard? My uncle was surprised at my question. He looked at me with apparent inquietude. Can you doubt, said he, that these were illusions? Does heaven, think you, interfere for such ends? Oh no, I think it not. Heaven cannot stimulate to such unheard of outrage. The agent was not good, but evil. Nay, my dear girl, said my friend, lay aside these fancies. Neither angel nor devil had any part in this affair. You misunderstand me, I answered. I believe the agency to be external and real, but not supernatural. Indeed, said he in an accent of surprise. Whom do you then suppose to be the agent? I know not. All is wildering conjecture. I cannot forget Carwin. I cannot banish the suspicion that he was the setter of these snares, but how can we suppose it to be madness? Did insanity ever before assume this form? Frequently. The illusion, in this case, was more dreadful in its consequences than any that has come to my knowledge, but I repeat that similar illusions are not rare. Did you ever hear of an instance which occurred in your mother's family? No. I beseech you, relate it. My grandfather's death I have understood to be extraordinary, but I know not in what respect. A brother to whom he was much attached died in his youth, and this, as I have heard, influenced in some remarkable way the fate of my grandfather, but I am unacquainted with the particulars. On the death of that brother, resumed my friend, my father was seized with dejection, and was found to flow from two sources. He was not only grieved for the loss of a friend, but entertained a belief that his own death would be inevitably consequent on that of his brother. He waited from day to day in expectation of the stroke which he predicted was speedily to fall upon him. Gradually, however, he recovered his cheerfulness and confidence. He married and performed his part in the world with spirit and activity. At the end of 21 years, it happened that he spent the summer with his family at a house which he possessed on the sea coast in Cornwall. It was at no great distance from a cliff which overhung the sea and rose into the air to a great height. The summit was level and secure and easily ascended on the land side. The company frequently repaired hither in clear weather and invited by pure airs and extensive prospects. One evening in June, my father, with his wife and some friends, chanced to be on this spot. Everyone was happy, and my father's imagination seemed particularly alive to the grandeur of the scene. Suddenly, however, his limbs trembled and his features betrayed alarm. He threw himself into the attitude of one listening. He gazed earnestly in a direction in which nothing was visible to his friends. This lasted for a minute. Then turning to his companions, he told them that his brother had just delivered to him a summons which must be instantly obeyed. He then took a hasty and solemn leave of each person, and before their surprise would allow them to understand the scene, he rushed to the edge of the cliff, threw himself headlong, and was seen no more. In the course of my practice in the German army, many cases equally remarkable have occurred. Unquestionably, the illusions were maniacal, though the vulgar thought otherwise. They are all reducible to one class, and are not more difficult of explication and cure than most affections of our fame. This opinion my uncle endeavored by various means to impress upon me. I listened to his reasonings and illustrations with silent respect. My astonishment was great on finding proofs of an influence of which I had supposed there were no examples, but I was far from accounting for appearances in my uncle's manner. Ideas thronged into my mind which I was unable to disjoin or to regulate. I reflected that this madness, if madness it were, had afflicted Pleyel and myself as well as Wieland. Pleyel had heard a mysterious voice. I had seen and heard. A form had showed itself to me as well as to Wieland. The disclosure had been made in the same spot. The appearance was equally complete and equally prodigious in both instances. Whatever supposition I should adopt, had I not equal reason to tremble? What was my security against influences equally terrific and equally irresistible? It would be vain to attempt to describe the state of mind which this idea produced. I wondered at the change which a moment had affected my brother's condition. Now was I stupefied with tenfold wonder in contemplating myself. Was I not likewise transformed from rational and human into a creature of nameless and fearful attributes? Was I not transported to the brink of the same abyss? Ere a new day should come, my hands might be embrued in blood, and my remaining life be consigned to a dungeon and chains. With moral sensibility like mine, no wonder that this new dread was more insupportable than the anguish I had lately endured. Grief carries its own antidote along with it. When thought becomes merely a vehicle of pain, its progress must be stopped. Death is a cure which nature or ourselves must administer. To this cure I now look forward with gloomy satisfaction. My silence could not conceal from my uncle the state of my thoughts. He made unwearied efforts to divert my attention from views so pregnant with danger. His efforts, aided by time, were in some measure successful. Confidence in the strength of my resolution and in the healthful state of my faculties was once more revived. I was able to devote my thoughts to my brother's state and the causes of this disastrous proceeding. My opinions were the sport of eternal change. Sometimes I conceived the apparition to be more than human. I had no grounds on which to build a disbelief. I could not deny faith to the evidence of my religion. The testimony of men was loud and unanimous. Both these concurred to persuade me that evil spirits existed and that their energy was frequently exerted in the system of the world. These ideas connected themselves with the image of Carwin. Where is the proof, said I, that demons may not be suggested to the control of men? This truth may be distorted and debased in the minds of the ignorant. The dogmas of the vulgar, with regard to this subject, are glaringly absurd, but though these may justly be neglected by the wise, we are scarcely justified in totally rejecting the possibility that men may obtain supernatural aid. The dreams of superstition are worthy of contempt. Witchcraft, its instruments and miracles, are compact ratified by a bloody signature. The apparatus of sulphurous smells and thundering explosions are monstrous and chimerical. These have no part in the scene over which the genius of Carwin presides. The conscious beings, dissimilar from human, but moral and voluntary agents as we are, somewhere exist and can scarcely be denied. That their aid may be employed to benign or malignant purposes cannot be disproved. Darkness rests upon the designs of this man. The extent of his power is unknown, but is there not evidence that it has been now exerted? I recurred to my own experience. Here Carwin had actually appeared upon the stage, but this was in a human character. A voice and a form were discovered, but one was apparently exerted, and the other disclosed, not to befriend, but to counteract Carwin's designs. There were tokens of hostility, and not of alliance, between them. Carwin was the miscreant whose projects were resisted by a minister of heaven. How can this be reconciled to the stratagem which ruined my brother? There the agency was at once preternatural and malignant. The recollection of this fact led my thoughts into a new channel. The malignity of that influence which governed my brother had hitherto been no subject of doubt. His wife and children were destroyed. They had expired in agony and fear. Yet was it disputably certain that their murderer was criminal? He was acquitted at the tribunal of his own conscience. His behavior at his trial and since was faithfully reported to me. His appearances were uniform. Not for a moment did he lay aside the majesty of virtue. He repelled all invectives by appealing to the deity and to the tenor of his past life. Surely there was truth in this appeal. None but a command from heaven could have swayed his will, and nothing but unerring proof of divine approbation could sustain his mind in its present elevation. Phew! You have been listening to Classics You Slept Through, chapters 15 through 20 of Wieland, or The Transformation, an American Tale. Tune in for our discussion episode. Peace.